You're listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined by Sachit Mehra, President of the Liberal Party of Canada. First elected in 2023, Sachit led the party through a leadership race and a general election that resulted in a fourth straight term. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Teresa, how are you?
I am doing great. So I'm really glad you could join me for this conversation because I think it's always good to check in, on the party side about how things are going. So you're the president of the Liberal Party of Canada. Of course, you've been doing this job for a little while, but I actually want to take us back to before that because I'm always interested in people's origin stories. I think people think that politics is something that's really hard to break into, but there are a lot of ways to do it. And maybe you can tell folks how you did it.
Oh, thanks very much. So first of all, Teresa, it's great to be here, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to join you today. Let's go back to the beginning and start there maybe. So I've been a volunteer with the Liberal Party of Canada. I believe this year will mark my 35th year.
Wow.
So I started with the party when I was 15 years old. I was in the middle of if you can imagine, I was this kid in the 80s in the middle of Winnipeg in Manitoba. And if you go back to that time, there weren't a lot of folks that looked like me, talked like me, had that same pop cultural background that I did, and making those connections at times could be difficult, especially having somebody, understand where you're coming from or what you're talking about or why that thing was important to you, whatever that thing was, right? Or why you wanted to be heard. And lo and behold, here was this group of people that were talking about all the things that kind of mattered to me and how multiculturalism was important. And, Teresa, do you remember that giant poster with the balloon and all the different flags on it? And being Canada, these were all in schools. They were kind of put up, at least in Manitoba. And, I remember
I'm too young.
You're too young. Okay, you're too young. All right. So that was my time. And I remember making that connection with the party. And, I got involved as a young Liberal. I quickly became president of the Young Liberals in Manitoba. I believe I was 17, 18 at the time. And, I met my then girlfriend, Caroline. She used to work for Reg Alcock as the student liaison at the University of Manitoba. And, we got married shortly after. And so I met my sweetheart there in the party. And she was, we've been together now for 28 years. And on the party side, look, I would continue to work in every aspect: communications, fundraising, co-chaired 3 provincial campaigns in Manitoba, work closely with all kinds of different groups. And in 2011, I became president of Liberal Party of Canada, Manitoba. So PTB chair in Manitoba, and served straight into the 2015 national campaign. So saw that happening. And I'm sure this week you saw the 10 years posts that were kind of going around social media channels. And, I put up a couple posts of my own just from that time, and looking back at that time, it was absolutely fascinating. And then in 2016, I became chair of FLAC. And FLAC is the Federal Liberal Agency of Canada. And essentially, it's the arm's length organization responsible for the party's legal agent duties, governance duties, things like that. And I spent the last, 2016 to 2022, 2023 there doing that work. So a lot of budget work, a lot of internal work, things like that around the party. And then in 22, I decided I would run for president of the Liberal Party of Canada, just because I believed so much in what we were doing and the direction that we were in. And, it was funny to me that, well, not funny, but it was heartwarming for me that, the things that I joined for back in 2015, those messages around DEI and all those things were still important today and still relevant around the party. And I ran for president. I campaigned for 14 months, coast to coast to coast, and went out there. It was fascinating. And I got a lot of questions around like, who are you? And, what does the president even do? And, here I am, in 23, I was elected at the May convention, which is a huge convention out in Ottawa. And here we are 2 years later, 2.5 years later.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because I always love these things. You go campaign for however many months and it's this exhausting thing. And then the reward, if you win, is more of the same. You have to go do the actual
Well,
job.
Teresa,
It's a lot of work.
You've heard the saying, right? What's the reward for good work?
More work.
More work, 100%, right? And
exactly.
boy, there's been a bit of work, Teresa.
Quite a bit. So, like you said, you became president in 2023, and at the time, the party was still doing okay in the polls. We haven't had a majority again since 2015. That was the one time that we had a majority in the last 10 years, and it's been minority since then. So, we've been more or less neck and neck in the polls with our opposition over that time. But there was a bit of a sink in the polls that happened over the last couple of years. This is, of course, before this period that we immediately just lived through. And, we went into the most recent campaign having been in power for a very long time. This is something that happens to governments. You eventually lose some support in the polls, mainly because you've been there for a long time. It's not even necessarily that people don't like you. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it is the fact that people are just really used to you and they want something different. But having said that, the polls started to dip a bit. And as we headed towards this 2025 election, which was actually supposed to be happening this fall around now, it happened in the spring instead. But in the lead up to that, there was a lot of consternation about polling numbers and whether the Liberal Party would be booted from office. What do you think went wrong over those 2 years, in your opinion?
Yeah, listen, and you've stated in your comments, I do think governments, any government anywhere in the world, there's a natural ebb and flow. There always is going to be. I've been around politics for 35 years at every level, municipal, provincial, federal, and you see this. You will have highs, lows. Those highs and lows will be predicated on, what's going on externally. Are there local issues? Are there national issues? Are there international issues? What's going on and how the public perceives that success, right? So these are always going to inform what's going on the government side, inside polling, and that's fine. And that inconsistency in terms of favorability is the consistent. That's the thing that you go with. But separating that from what the party does, I think is an important distinction, right? Because our work on the party side as a strong independent entity has to be focused on, and our work doesn't change, or it should not change. It should be consistently focused on the goal of winning campaigns. And everything that looks like underneath that, whether that's resources, whether that's staff, whether that's volunteers, whether that's messaging, whatever those things are, and all those pillars and building underneath there, we have to keep doing no matter what's going on over here. And so if you look at the last couple of years, and I won't spend too much time other than to say, we focused so much on our volunteer engagement, our volunteer training, no matter what was going on externally. We focused on our infrastructure, both electronic and on staffing side. We focused on our resources, not only from an expenditure standpoint, but also from an income standpoint. And we also kept on top of our messaging, whatever that looked like on the different channels, and made sure that was consistent as we move forward. Back to the thing I opened with, Teresa, consistency was key. And that's really what people want to see from the party, being able to trust that brand and knowing that it was going to be there and do that thing and keep doing that thing. And, when it came time, when we had to meet that moment, Liberals stepped up and we met that moment. The organization met that moment, whatever it looked like. And, here we are. So I think consistency and being ready to do the work was absolutely key on the party side, and making sure that we're not too it's not what's going on externally that is always informing what we're doing. We need to be consistent in what we're doing as we move forward.
Right. So I want to talk now about the leadership race. I have a lot of thoughts on leadership races because I've, been on so-called team neutral a number of times on the provincial side. But also, if I have to think about the hardest time for a party president, it's not a general election because there are so many other players involved in that, in the leader's office, whatever it may be. When it comes to a leadership race, a lot of focus does end up on the party president because you're in charge of a lot of the decision making that gets made, even if it's, appointing other people to start making decisions in that leadership process. You also had the challenge of doing it in one of the tightest timelines I have ever seen. I was involved in the 2012-13 Ontario Liberal leadership race, which was just over 100 days long. I believe it was 103 days long. You had a very similar experience where you had a prorogued parliament. We had one of those too. You had a party with declining fortunes in the polls. We had one of those too. You had people saying, how could you possibly continue in government after this long in office? Very, very similar experiences. But you also had things like the Hogue report going on about political interference, which was sort of, a cloud over this process as well. You had other political parties at the federal scene who had done digital voting and had a lot of snafus with it. You had just been talking about tech. I think the party did a great job actually with the voting procedures. But take us through what this looked like at the time. Because we also had, I forgot to add, we had the Trump economic crisis on top of all of this. It was a very, very insane time to be doing anything, let alone changing the leadership of a political party and the country. Can you talk about how your team pulled this off at all? Because I think a lot of people don't have the same insight that I would have of just how insane a task this was to carry out. And you did it extremely successfully.
So before I say anything, let me just please acknowledge the phenomenal people at LPC Central, Liberal Party of Canada Central. This is an incredible group of people. And often, we look at party structures and in our minds, we think it's this giant monolithic block with thousands of people streaming in and out. And the reality is it's a couple of handfuls of really hardworking, dedicated people that give their blood, sweat, and tears and life, towards an organization and its goals. And really, all you folks know who you are. You did a phenomenal job and absolutely incredible. Teresa, looks, I don't know how much time we have on this call, if it's hours to answer that question. Listen, what a moment in time. Sunday, January 5th, I got a call from the boss signaling his intentions. 6 o'clock in the morning, I was on a flight to Ottawa from Winnipeg. And just like you, I watched the news in terms of the message that was being shared and what was going to be happening. And, that morning, we were in a situation where the party was 18 points in the polls. There was no process in place at that point. We had an interim leader. To your point, we were 21 days, 23 days outside of the Hogue report. And so within the Canadian cultural ether, political cultural ether, if you will, there was questions around FI. So that was generally there as well. And, we had 77 days to turn it around. The first step was to absolutely design a process where it understood and undertook the concerns of the membership and Canadians and folks that wanted to get involved inside the process, and they told us they wanted secure, they wanted identifiable, and they wanted easy. And so that's what we worked towards. And, the national board stepped up, spent hours and hours and hours and days on this to quickly turn around a process because time was of the essence. Every single day, every single hour that we spent on this was less days on the leadership side, right? And so, the process that we came up with was absolutely watertight and airtight, and that was good because on the other side, not only were you going to be obviously putting in the next leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, but then also the Prime Minister of Canada, and so it had to be just perfect. At the end we had 300,000 registered Liberals come on board. We had over 160,000 participate, and I'll remember this number directly. We had 151,899 participate in that vote. And Teresa, if you asked me, whatever random number, 77,832, who was that person? I know I could point to a piece of, verified ID, an undertaking, a consent, all the details. The only thing I couldn't tell you is how that person voted, right? But that's how secure and tight the system was as we went through. And, it was, to your point earlier, it was innovative. We partnered with a national corp. There's 6,000 locations. People could vote from their couch. They could go into a location if they needed help. They could do that. Like, this has never been done before, and it absolutely set the bar. And so to come full circle, on the other side of 77 days, we had completed a successful process, ticking all those boxes. There were zero questions around FI, and in fact, we had pressed it head and shoulders above any recommendations that were coming out, or that had come out. We had a popular leader in place. We had completed the 77-day mandate. And from a polling standpoint, we went from 18 to, I can't recall exactly what it was, 34, 35 at that point. And so the jump was absolutely huge. But I can tell you, during those 77 days, the amount of folks that stepped up from the board, on the committees, the work that was done on the ground was daily, hourly. From an organizational standpoint, it was absolutely fantastic, and then, straight from there, 13 days later, 14 days later, we were into the campaign. It was a remarkable period of time. I believe it was the biggest, if not one of the biggest turnarounds in Canadian political history.
I want to talk about that and give the team a bit more of their flowers, because none of that happens. That rebound doesn't happen if people question the process. And this is something that I take very, very personally as somebody who has been involved in these type of efforts in the past. Team neutral is something that is extremely important. It makes sure that nobody's questioning the process. You'll know this, and I won't make you say it out loud, but I'll say it out loud. During a leadership race, you'll get a lot of the teams complaining about, oh, well, how come that team gets this and this and this? And there's all these complaints about various things. And people are like, oh, you're favoring that team. And it's like, no, we find you all equally annoying right now. That's really how it does tend to feel. But that neutrality is extremely important. Everyone who signs those neutrality agreements when they come on to the leadership convention team, the leadership race team, they take it extremely, extremely seriously, because it is about keeping people's faith in democracy ultimately. And to be able to do that all without any question in 77 days, employing entirely new practices in this culture that we were in, where people were asking about foreign interference, like it really is something that we did not have time to celebrate at the time, because we were immediately into a campaign. But I do think, when we look back at this moment in history, you will all rightly be told what a good job you did, because it really was excellent. And it's not just because I've been in similar shoes in the past, but it was really, really great work. And I think it's a model to perhaps look forward to, going forward in other races as well. We've got one coming up in Ontario too. Even just the question of whether we can eventually move towards online elections and online voting. This is something that sort of opens the door to those kind of conversations. So I just wanted to say what a great job you guys did on that front, because I was very impressed.
Thank you for saying that. And, you're 100% correct. And it's why I opened up the conversation with acknowledging the team on the LPC side, right? The stuff that was done there and the things that they were charged with executing, in a couple of weeks turnaround time. And, what was asked was huge. And it was remarkable, the work that was being done, again, on a daily, hourly basis, as you move forward. And again, it was important, right? The weight of the moment of where we were, both from internal, external factors. Again, all anybody has to do is rewind to, cultural Canada 2025 January, and you'll recall the moment where we were at. And so we absolutely had to meet that moment, and they did. And I couldn't be prouder of everybody at LPC office for what they did at the moment. These folks all know who they are. They're incredible. And the national board, right, which is a group of volunteers from coast to coast to coast. These are PTB chairs from every corner of the country that are getting together and advising of the situation. And, on the night of when we announced the winner, and I think this was televised, I actually asked the national board to stand up and take a bow because of the work that they had done and how remarkable it was. And, and I think, Teresa, you're right. Maybe externally, folks may not see what was done there, but for those of us, and I don't want to call us political nerds, but for those of us that are really informed of what this looks like, as you move forward, how the cookies are baked, how these things are done, it was remarkable. And I further think, I know that we set a bar, and not only did we set a bar, I think for other parties and other organizations setting forward, but it's also a bar, I think, an expectation amongst Canadians. They want to have a safe campaign, they want to have a secure campaign, and they want to have one where they can trust in the system and the process. And that's exactly what we've delivered. And again, I'm proud of the team, I'm proud of the volunteers, I'm part of the organization, and I'm proud of the result that we have on the other side. It was not easy, but it was good and fulfilling work at the same time.
How much sleep do you think you got?
Not enough. But but as a restaurant person, and in fact, I'm calling you from the restaurant today. I'm in the front, in the front room. I'm used to maybe 5-6 hours a night. But I'll tell you, on those days, like when I flew in on the 6th on Monday, like I flew in at 6, so I was up all night because it was a red eye. You don't want to miss the flight, right? And I flew in. And, that night we had started phone calls and organizations and meetings. I don't think I got to bed that night till 2:00 in the morning. So whatever that is, almost 19 hours, 22 hours. And then I was up again at 6 the next morning again, because that exact same process. And it continued on like that for, I would say, a solid week, as we were just connecting with Canadians and members and folks across the country, coast to coast, that wanted to inform. And they also wanted to know what was going on. What was the process looking like? And some things you can talk about, and some things you can't talk about. And at the time as well, I would say to you, for me and for the party, the focus really was the leadership contestants, right? These folks that were going to be running. That's where the focus needed to be, right? The focus wasn't the process. The focus wasn't the president. The focus wasn't the org. The focus was these folks. And that's what we really want to highlight for Canadians and for the membership across the board. And, it worked, right? People showed up. People participated. People engaged across the country. For us to go from 18 to 34, 35, 36, whatever that number was there, depending on the poll, it's 77 days is absolutely unheard of, but it speaks to people's trust. And again, being consistent and being legitimate with what we did on the process side, I think was massive. I do recall coming back to Winnipeg, I think a week outside, I think it was back on the Monday, a week later, and putting in a solid 9 hours, if I'm not mistaken. Right? So it was good.
I always say to people, like, there's 3 things you don't want to see made: laws, sausages, and events. And I would count this as, a very long scale event. And if you're doing it right, to your point, people don't notice the process. They notice the front end version that you're trying to present to them. So kudos to you folks on that. Having said all that work, we then moved into a campaign period almost immediately. Now, I say that as if you weren't already doing all that work ahead of time. I know there was bios being written and candidates being nominated throughout this process. So all that work was going on for a very long time in the lead up to what would have been a fall campaign. But it really kicked off into high gear at this point because you were leading into an election. We were just talking about the polling numbers and how they had bounced back. But that can still go wrong at that point. We saw, in the US election, those polling numbers bounce back up after a leadership change on the Democratic side. However, it didn't continue and they ended up losing that campaign. So you can have this bump from a leadership race and still lose. We saw that also with Kim Campbell when she became leader in 1993 of the Conservative Party. So this is something that can happen. You have to sustain that momentum and put together a really great campaign in order to win, which is something that you guys did. So you immediately bounced into a campaign. What was that, 2-3 weeks later? I can't even remember anymore.
14 days, 13 days.
What was
Not that I'm counting.
No, not at all. What was that transition and like, and how did you, get campaign headquarters up to snuff? I've been in a campaign headquarters that was formed, in a minority legislature, and we knew with like maybe 2 days notice that we had to get the campaign office up and running. Internet took 5 days. It was not helpful to say the least. You obviously have LPC headquarters that a lot of this work happens out of anyway, but what was it like ramping up into this campaign, which was, not quite the same length as that really, really long 2015 campaign, but it wasn't like a totally short campaign either.
I guess there's a few ways to look at this, right? And, first of all, maybe just rewinding, it is remarkable to go from a historic leadership vote race spanning 77 days to 13 days later, 14 days later, depending on how you want to count it, straight into a campaign. Absolutely stunning. The transition work required. So, I mean, maybe that was one category, right? Just transitioning website, materials, information, distributables, all of those things into a campaign mode and switching from one leader to the next, right? And making sure all of that is consistent with, a brand going out was, a significant undertaking, right? And again, there's no light switch. It's not a switch. It's a process. And that process, undertakes, days or a week or, or as an ongoing thing as you move forward. So, those things were happening and you saw them in real time. If you were on Facebook or Instagram or any of those things, you saw our messaging and, what that looked like in real time as it went on. And then, there's another category that I would say, is the tip of the iceberg stuff, right? So what you're seeing during the campaign, really, there's an entire year's worth of work that is happening behind the scenes, right? Whether that looks like campaign colleges, whether it looks like training for staff, volunteers, whether it looks like messaging calls, like our national organizing calls, whether it looks like resourcing inside our digital tools, whatever that stuff looks like, that's being built, back to that message of consistency. That is never changing. That's always happening. So when the moment comes, you are ready to step in and you've got those things. There is no way any party, any organization would, be able to, build that iceberg stuff in 10 days, 12 days. You just can't. There's just no momentum there. You have to build the other side where all those people have seen that consistent messages for the last 12, 24, 16 months, 600 months, whatever it is, as we go into that, so that when they have to come, they can trust that brand and they know that it's always going to be there and that message is going to be consistent. And so that's exactly what we did. So I think those two pieces were critical. The stuff you saw on the surface right away, and then the other stuff that was happening underground over the last couple of years to build towards this campaign. Suffice to say, and all of that together, not easy. Certainly, long hours, long days. Again, hats off to the team, not only in Ottawa, but coast to coast to coast. The party has a footprint across the country with our staff, and they just do a phenomenal job. And I can tell you, they were working so diligently. But a huge shout out also to all the candidates who were also working, right? And these, this was all 343 candidates across the country, Charlottetown to Winnipeg South to Victoria, Vancouver Island to Whitehorse, right? All of these folks just going type messaging, conference calls, calls with members, EDA leads, teams. These preps were having feverishly, as people were getting into place and getting the materials out, and us getting packages and supplies, distributables, electronic and otherwise, out to all these folks. It was absolutely a fever pitch in terms of work, and rightly so, as it should be when you're getting into that kind of situation. And I remember myself getting ready, and I had a bit of the duties or the honor of the alt tour, at that time, and I don't know how many events the leader did, over 100, I'm sure, and I think I was second with 66 across the country, and really seeing a lot of these teams on the ground doing that work, especially in the first few days, the first week of the campaign. It was phenomenal to see the efforts that were being made. It was really awesome.
And honestly, I think that aux tour that you do, that auxiliary tour, is extremely important. I know, on the provincial side, I've seen a number of different presidents actually do that as well. They try to get to as many ridings as they can, because the leader can't be everywhere. The leader has to go where it's strategic, but it's really helpful to have an active, engaged president actually go into the ridings and make sure volunteers feel appreciated. And the end result of the campaign was, not the majority people may have been hoping for, which may have been a bit of a big leap anyway, given where we started in the campaign. But we did fall slightly short of it. Still, it was a victory. But in a lot of campaigns, we tend to only do a campaign debrief if we lose. We don't tend to look back at what was done, how we can make improvements, what we've learned if we win. Have you done a campaign debrief? Are you planning on doing one? I think there's a lot to learn from this campaign in particular, just given the whirlwind that it happened in, and how quickly you had to put things together.
Yeah, and maybe just for a second on the campaign side, listen, I couldn't be prouder of the campaign and the team and the candidates across the country. At the end of the day, over 8 million votes received, the highest in Canadian history. We sent the largest women's caucus to Ottawa in the history of the country, one of the largest, if not the largest, Indigenous caucus. We sent 4 people under 25 to caucus, talking about youth issues and what's important to them from both gender perspectives. Like, good on us, right? And I think for good measure, I think we sent a couple of seniors to Ottawa as well, if I'm not mistaken. So you're covering off all those categories. It was great. The largest BC caucus in the party's history, the biggest Quebec caucus since 45 years. At 169 members, the largest staff deployment in the history of the party, the largest volunteer deployment in the history of the party, the best fundraising year in the history of the party, and that's growing every day. Look, I think by every metric, we did exceedingly well, and I'm super happy about that. And for sure, on all that end, there's a debrief too, and it has to happen. And I know in the days after the campaign, I can tell you, and actually it took weeks, is that I called personally every candidate that won or didn't win. And we spent time on the phone together, talking about pluses and glitches and whatnot. And I made those calls across the country. That's 343 calls for anybody keeping track. And, it was awesome to talk to these folks. And, the one message that jumped out from those folks that had run and didn't win that time was, can I run again? I had great experience. This was fantastic. I love being on the door. I love talking to Canadians. I love talking to my fellow neighbors and what's going on. And, again, if you look back at the 25 campaign for a lot of these folks, at that moment in Canadian history, and largely even now, it was, what was going on at the time. You would read it in the newspaper, you would see it on your phone, you would hear about it on the radio in terms of what was going on with our neighbors. And I think Canadians listened to all that, really felt it viscerally as well. And they needed to talk to somebody. They needed that person. And so, the candidate would show up at the door and they would get their earphone, or they would hear, they'd be empathetic. And this was massive. And for a lot of people, that is hugely engaging. It's why you're involved in politics, to be there, to help, to create, to communicate, to move forward. And that's what a lot of these folks are doing. And I think that's where a lot of this, this energy is. So, being able to connect with them and call around was massive. Those debriefs, I personally attended debriefs in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, online across the country. My fellow colleagues on the NBOD are doing this across the country in their local regions as well. It's happening as well from caucus sides, all the way down internally on party side. So I would say all levels, horizontally and vertically. We've had hundreds of conversations like that that are happening everywhere, right? And I think those are important because you have to be able to inform your decision making as you go, as you go forward, and your path making as you go forward. And I think those calls are supremely important, and we'll continue to do them. And again, not to sound like a broken record, but these things are never a single moment in time. They continue to be a process as you do them, right? Because somebody may have felt something within days after the campaign, but have a different viewpoint weeks or months after the campaign. And those calls continue. I think you need to be open to those calls as you do them. So we'll continue to do them, and we'll continue to move into them as well. And I think, another great point for all of that as well, of being face to face and doing those things, will be the convention. And that's coming in April next year in Montreal. I believe it's the 9th and 10th, the 11th, that weekend. Anyways, and it's going to be huge. And I think you're going to see people from coast to coast to coast that are going to come in and, deliberate and talk and see panels and have discussions and build and do those things. I think that's a powerful thing, having those conversations personally.
So you made my pivot for me, which is that I want to talk a little bit about the future now. So obviously, these conventions, these biennial conventions, are a great time to go to. I have a lot of great memories of past ones. They're really fun to go to, especially after you've won a campaign, because it is a bit of a celebration. But it's also a look forward to the next campaign and the work we're doing in between. So, something that happens to a lot of governments is they get really, really focused on the governing side, and they don't focus so much on the political side that helps them stay in office. You've talked earlier today about how important it is to have almost an always on campaign sense about things, where you're constantly putting in the work to make sure that you're ready for the next campaign. Something I want to talk about is digital. So we know that the party is pretty good at this, but we also know that the Conservatives are excellent at it. Their YouTube prowess is, next to none in the rest of the country. They are very, very good at a lot of the elements of digital campaigning. I personally think we're going to get into a place where we have digital first campaigns, which isn't to say you aren't going to be door knocking, but it does mean that the first time people hear from us and see our messages is often going to be online. And there are a lot of different places online where people will be engaging with those messages. So we have to be excellent on that front. We have to be keeping up with technology and trends. This is going to be the main battlefield for a lot of voters that we actually engage with. We also know that's just where people are now. I was talking to one of those new 21st century MPs, Amadee Sodi. She came on last week. That episode's going to appear after yours, but we were talking a lot about digital and TikTok and what the Youth Caucus is helping to inform the party on this front, because their noses are to the ground on this. It's their colleagues at the same age who are on these platforms. And we had a lot of conversation about how these platforms are also responding to their users in terms of how they're structuring their content and their feeds and all these things going forward. So where is the party on digital? You talked about how there's been some advancements, recently. And where do you see this going as we head to the convention and beyond?
Yeah, not to be overly funny, Teresa, but yes. Of course, digital is massive. and it's all encompassing and it's all over the place. And, to your point, for sure, it is for many people their first contact in terms of what they see on the party. And, let's also discuss, where this is, where that first contact is going to be. Social can change depending on demographic. It can change depending on cultural background, right? I might be considered, I'm aging myself, the Facebook generation, right? Then you've got Instagram generation underneath there. And then you've got the TikTok generation, which might be another age bracket, generally speaking, underneath that again. Is there something else? I'm sure there is. Maybe there's a whole community of folks that are on Reddit that approach the discussions completely different and maybe a more long form style versus the short form visual style on TikTok. Instagram being a middle ground and Facebook being something in between yet again. And then if you look at the cultural nuances broken over social, you've got WhatsApp, you've got WeChat, we've got different large communities communicating, strictly just on those platforms as well. So that's the retail side of digital. I think it's constantly expanding. I think it needs to be engaged on for sure. Either you're putting your messaging or you're monitoring messaging or seeing what's going on, right? Just to see what's important in the community and what folks are talking about. I think that needs to continuously be there. But there's another side to digital, right? And that's the back end of digital. So what does that look like, right? And people never talk about that. But that's the infrastructure to your website. And I'll give you a great example. We had made investments into our backend infrastructure long before and continuously into what was going on in 25 doing the leadership vote process and that campaign. The pitch, the fever pitch interactions with our website during the leadership vote process and during the campaign, would have brought other websites down. You would have had 404s. We stayed up. There was no issues. Why? Because we had made that infrastructure. I mean, can you imagine, Teresa, if you're logging on to liberal.ca, you get a 404, depending on whatever the interaction is, it's not a good look. And so we had 100% uptime. And that I think was very important on all kinds of levels, right? Empowering your volunteers, right? Tools like libsocial.ca that we put out there, and this is a tool. If you haven't been there, I encourage you. Libsocial.ca, empowered folks to quickly put messages out over X or Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever your threads, whatever particular feed was, with up-to-date messaging, infographics, whatever, and tailor your own messaging. And that way you didn't have to sit there and produce your own thing. It could be there, right? And I think also giving organizers tools that are modern, efficient, and that produce results. And that's something we invested in over the last year as well, without going into too many details. And we had given that to our campaign leads and our campaign managers, and it was something that came back in the debriefs and feedback as hugely helpful, right? And so I think it looks, you've got the two sides to it, right? I think there is a third side as well, and that is the, if you will, the user side, if you will, of the equation, right? And so this is people producing their own content, right? And you have folks going out there and they've got their own channels, they've got their own podcasts, they've got their own TikTok or their own Instagram, and putting these things up, and the demand for the content in whatever format, whether it's long form or short form or visual or written, is huge. People want to know. People want to be informed on whatever medium they consume it from, right? Whether, again, that's WhatsApp, WeChat, Instagram, Facebook, so forth, right? So there is this whole niche, and that's a gap that, look, frankly, any party, is never going to be able to fulfill. That's something that they go in, they create their message, they create their take, and they produce that thing. And that is also hugely beneficial and hugely powerful, right? So I think you've got, digital is this all-encompassing thing. I think you have to look at it from all the angles, and I think you have to be in a position where you can support all the angles as well. You're never, ever going to be able to cover every single avenue and venue of all those things, but I think being aware and able to respond is going to be extremely important, especially as we move into 2030 and you start seeing things like AI starting to be a bigger part of what's going on, how people communicate. You know, I remember, oh God, 10 years ago, which is maybe not that long ago, or maybe it is, depending on where you are, but 10 years ago, phone numbers were still a thing. And by phone numbers, I mean landlines, right? And today, landlines are all but non-existent. So how do you communicate with those people, right? And you can't get cell phone numbers. It's very, very difficult. So it has to be through these other media. And so I think we need to continue to invest in those things. I think we need to continue to partner. I think we need to continue to build towards that. And I think we need to keep having those tools that empower our supporters to do what they want to do as we move forward.
The one pitch I will give you as you head towards the convention is the idea that this is something the Democrats did in the US. They had, for their convention, they invited digital creators, like content creators, podcasters, whatever it was, to come to the convention and, be a bit of a fly on the wall of what was going on and help, beam that back to their audiences. Because, of course, these people, we have our audience, we're growing, but we're not the size of some of these other audiences. But some people have really, really engaged in large audiences that are not willing to engage with political parties directly, but are willing to have their messages filtered back to them through these people that they trust. And there is a growing ecosystem of these people. I think the conservatives are really good with engaging with those on the right. But I think progressive parties have not done this work to build these relationships. It's digital organizing essentially. And, something I recommend you consider for that event is inviting these folks. But it does actually help me pivot to my next question, which is about the generational and gender divides that we're seeing in society, and they are not new. I'm a millennial. This is something I've been saying for at least 15 years. There's this growing divide on gender lines, especially within younger generations. And we know that a lot of young men specifically have not been leaning towards progressive parties, including the Liberal Party. Younger people in Gen Z do not see themselves as liberals in general. It's not a brand identity that they attach to themselves. What's the strategy for bringing back younger voters into the Liberal coalition without risking losing, the existing coalition?
I think the party has a lot of work that it needs to do to continue connecting with folks. It's never a fait accompli. It's never, one and done. It's always a process. We are fortunate within the organization to have at the board level our commission structure that exists. From the Women's Commission to the Indigenous Commission to the Seniors Commission to the Young Liberals Commission, and these folks going out and doing the work. As I mentioned earlier, I think just prior to when we were recording, I was on a call last night about gender politics, women in politics. And it was fantastic. 2 days before that, I was on a call with the National Women's Commission and our chair there talking about how to support women in politics. And so that's a huge thing. And again, it needs to be consistent, right? People need to be able to trust what you're doing and what you're saying. It has to be that consistent message throughout. And the commissions do a phenomenal work. We talk about Women's Commission. Look at the Young Liberals Commission, campus clubs across the country that we're having over the last couple of years that we built in. I remember being at the University of Manitoba launch for their Young Liberal club there last year. When they kicked it off in December, they had 73, 75 young people show up. It was incredible. It was an incredible thing to behold, and them talking about politics and being interested of what's going on the ground. And then lo and behold, you're sending 4 young people under 25 to Parliament to talk about those issues that are important, right? Whether, on the government side, whatever those are, whether it's housing, affordability, mental health services, whatever those things are. Here you've got some trusted voices right from the community talking about those things. And that applies equally towards our Indigenous group, our Women's Commission, our Seniors Commission. It's important that we continue investing in those organizations at a board level. So that's at the human level, and I think that's important. I think on the messaging side and the digital side, we continue to still have those messages reinformed or informed from an electronic standpoint. So those structures are there, and also supporting those commissions, right? You want to have folks in place that they can turn to. You want to have systems in place and tools in place that they can use to communicate and keep building that out, because none of that stuff happens in a vacuum. So making sure when you're approaching these things, it's never a one and done type of thing. It's something that you're building out in a structure, and it has some practicality where people can feel that they can engage, they can move out, and they can communicate. And I think that's a huge thing. And again, that work will continue, and as we build toward next campaign, whenever that is.
Well, I will say our audience on this podcast, it's funny talking about digital because people have assumptions about, which platforms, which types of people are on. And when I started this podcast, I would not have expected that, like 75% of our listenership is men under the age of 35. That's not what I would have expected, but that is the case. So you're doing some of that work today by being on this podcast. So thank you for that. Just as we close off here, as we head towards the convention in Montreal, there's going to be, your usual board elections. There's going to be other programming. You can answer this if you want or not, but is your name going to be on the ballot at the convention?
I am running for my second term of president of the Liberal Party of Canada. I can tell you right now, it's been an honor of a lifetime serving as president and culminating a 34-year career as a volunteer with the party. And it's been incredible to play a role within the democratic process of this country, and at a time in the world, Teresa, where democracy really is the special thing, and where you really do want to guard it, and where being Canadian means something more than ever before. That's the time that we're in right now. Going back to January, February, March, of the year, it really did feel like, you were running with something that was just so very important and that people were watching and hopeful for, and, really wanted to feel like we had it, and we did. And so for me personally, it's been a remarkable journey over the last couple of years. I'm going to continue on into my last term. As you know, presidents have, or table officers in the party have maximum limit terms. But as I continue that on, I want to make sure I leave the party also with all the tools as it builds towards the next generation, or whatever that looks like, those foundational pieces. And you want to leave something in a position where it's stronger than it was before. And, we've been successful so far, and we'll keep building towards that.
I think that's an excellent note to end on. Thanks so much for joining me today, Sachit.
Thank you, Teresa. It was an absolute pleasure. Please call anytime.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian communications company specializing in content creation, narrative development, and strategic communications. Our music was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.